Hey there. Today on the podcast, I'm talking with Andy Sinclair-Harris about his work at Walt Disney Imagineering on Hong Kong Disneyland, including the Halloween edition of the Jungle Cruise, which is really crazy. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks for joining me here on episode 89 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. I've been really lucky to have a chance to talk to some former Imagineers about their work on a bunch of different Disney parks, but most of the focus has been on Walt Disney World and some on Disneyland. I have rarely spoken to people about overseas parks beyond Paris and a little bit about Tokyo. That's what I really liked about having a chance to talk to Andy Sinclair-Harris. He knows so much about theme park design, has a background in theater, and is a really amazing concept artist. And he spent most of his time at WDI working on Hong Kong Disneyland, which the park opened in the mid-2000s with not that many attractions, and Disney has been working since to really beef up the roster. They added 3 lands more recently, and now they're going to add Frozen and the Stark Expo. And Andy was involved with a shop in Toy Story Land, and then with the addition of Fairy Tale Forest at Fantasyland, and with the Jungle Cruise Curse of the Emerald Trinity Halloween overlay, which sounds really cool. We also talked about Doctor Who, the experience, and I've really enjoyed some of the recent seasons of Doctor Who, including with Matt Smith and David Tennant. And I haven't caught up with the current version yet with Jodie Whittaker, but I'm excited to do so. So it's super cool that Andy worked on the design for a complicated walkthrough attraction that spotlighted Doctor Who. And we dig into all that and so much more during this podcast. So before I get to Andy, as you know, the holidays are just around the corner. And if you're looking for a unique holiday gift, my wife Erin creates music-themed art and gifts. She's offering a special deal for listeners of this podcast. If you make an order from Erin and enter the code TS15, you can save 15% off your order. You can check out all of Erin's art in her shop by going to erinheaton.com. That's ERINHEATON.com, and the code is TS15. So I could tell right away from talking to Andy that he has a lot of enthusiasm about Disney and about design for theme parks, and he is still consulting for Disney and also working at a company in the UK. For someone who's still fairly young and has a lot more ahead of him, it's great to hear that much passion about the parks and what goes into them. So I'm really excited to bring you this podcast. Here is Andy Sinclair-Harris. I want to start by talking a bit about your educational background, because I know you went into school for theater and theater design, and I'd love to know how that interested you and how that kind of connects to what you do now.
Well, it's interesting because I think it was a kind of culmination of 2 things that were interesting me at the time. I think, obviously, living here in the UK, I ended up going to Disney World in the early 90s, I think it was. And it's like a lot of Imagineers or people who wanted to becoming an Imagineer, it had a really kind of profound effect on me, especially EPCOT Center at the time. And just coming back from that and thinking that was what I wanted to do, because I was at that age where I was probably about 8 or 9, where I knew that it was there was an artifice to this world. That I was on Spaceship Earth and I was looking down at how the ride was moving, and I knew that they were animatronics. And I just remember thinking, oh wow, there must be people who do this. There must be people who actually plan these things and decide where they go and everything. And at the same time, when I was at school, I was kind of really enjoying theatre, but from an aspect of not being on stage, but just kind of having an overall sense of the world, like creating the kind of obviously set design, things like that. They're just creating these worlds and this vision. So it kind of got to a point in my life when I was younger where these kind of two bisected really, and I'm sure you've probably heard of it as well, but I'm sure a lot of the listeners have heard. There was a documentary, famous Imagineering one called Shoot for the Moon, I think it was. I don't know if you've heard of it or not, but it aired here in the UK around the time that Space Mountain was opening at Disneyland Paris. It was basically like a marketing tool for the people, to get people in Europe to go to Disneyland Paris. But that was where you kind of literally went behind the scenes of Imagineering for one of the first times, as I can recall, I think, that you really went there and saw young Marty Sklar, Tim Delaney, moustaches everywhere. It was amazing. And, you see Tom Morris and everything, and you kind of go into Imagineering. And then that was just the kind of crystallization of, oh my goodness, these are the people who do these things. They're called Imagineers. I would love to do that. So educationally, I thought the best thing to do was to kind of maintain that theatre design aspect, the fact that you were, studying a play text and, creating that and putting that into the real world. So that, to me, seemed like the best kind of, side that appealed to me to kind of go into Imagineering if I wanted to go into Imagineering.
Yeah, and actually I am familiar with that documentary because I talked to Tim Delaney on this show back in the fall, and I had not seen it at the time, and he mentioned how big of a hit that was and how people really, when Paris was opening. And I watched it on YouTube after that, and you're right. I mean, especially given, now we have this Imagineering series going on Disney Plus, but still, even now, I watched that and thought, we don't really see too much of that. So I'm imagining as a kid that had to really play a role for you.
Absolutely. And again, we're going back a long time before there was social media and before there was any way for me to know really too much about Imagineering. Again, because I'm in the UK, I'm not in the US, and there's no real way, because the early Imagineers or the second generations who got into that kind of knew someone who knew someone, and they worked at Disneyland, and there was a ways into Imagineering. But for me, living in the UK and just having this dream to do this job, I had no idea of the people who actually did these things. So to see this documentary, and it was in the UK, it was on the BBC here. So again, this is going back a way when there was only kind of 4 channels in the UK, and you had this, so it was on the BBC. It's a big deal. So lots of people saw that documentary, and I know for a fact there were a lot of people who saw that, and it was really profound to them. And like I said, this is coming off the back from me coming from EPCOT and already being interested in the actual design. I suppose it was my kind of like fledgling interest in theme park design and how these worlds are created, and then actually seeing that realized. This documentary was literally a few weeks after I got back from EPCOT, and then I think we then ended up going to Disneyland Paris after seeing that. So the marketing worked in that sense. But as you say, it's just to have that camera going around Imagineering and seeing Tim Delaney's sketch, and then I was so fascinated by seeing his original sketches and having read how perfectly he kind of aligns the original Jules Verne book to the attraction, what is essentially a roller coaster, how he makes that so much more than that. It's more than the sum of his parts, which I was just fascinated by that. And then you see the special effects being tested and the lighting, and I was hooked. So it was a great documentary. So anyone who hasn't seen it, I think it is on YouTube, as you say, right? You could go see it.
Yeah, it's easy to find. You just search for it and it came up right away, and it's a pretty decent quality. Given the quality of TV at the time, but it's pretty easy to watch for sure.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I actually went to Paris once, and in like 2006, and that whole park is like that. You mentioned the connection to Jules Verne, and just, I'm sure you've probably been there just given proximity of London to Paris, plus your work at Disney, but it's a gorgeous park that I loved. But I want to go back to EPCOT because I know you mentioned going there when you were younger, and I assume that was in the 90s when things like Horizons and Journey to Imagination and others were still there. And I'd love to know why that connected with you so strongly when you went there as a kid.
So yeah, you're right. I ended up going to Walt Disney World first before Disneyland Paris. So, and as you say, this was 91, 92. So I was at the kind of I still believe it was a good period for EPCOT, obviously, because, having been open about a decade, it was still, to me, it was still in its kind of heyday, as it were. So I rode on Horizons, I rode on Journey to Imagination, and those 2 attractions specifically, just something completely just clicked with me, resonated with me. The fact that Horizons, you just came off of that attraction and it was a sense that the future was going to be okay, and if anything, if you could have a part in playing in that future to make it better. Again, I just think that early days of Epcot was a kind of call to action for people to kind of become involved, and that's what resonated with me. And the same with Journey to Imagination. I loved how Journey to Imagination was a completely whimsical attraction that was just kind of breathtaking in its fantastical nature. And there isn't really anything like that now within Disney, and it's such a shame that Journey to Imagination no longer exists in the form that it did, because it's such an evergreen attraction that didn't really, unfortunately, need updating. And that's a topic for another time. But both of those attractions, like I said, Horizons and Journey to Imagination, stuck with me. Now, I think for Horizons, it was the sheer scale of it. I mean, I remember going through the show sets, and you remember in Horizons when you kind of go around in the kind of on-mover cars, and then you'll see a kind of a kitchen set, and then you go to outside, and you'll kind of see like a kind of a patio, kind of outside kind of veranda, and there'll be someone's shoes there, and then you kind of look out into the kind of cityscape. And to me, it was just, again, it was kind of clicking into my kind of theatre design brain, the fact that it was these spaces that were designed so well. It really resonated with me that these were, and again, back at that time, I'd never been anything like that. These weren't, amusement parks. These weren't roller coasters. These were something completely different. It was this kind of bisecting kind of point between a theatre and a film. It was this kind of middle ground that I'd never experienced. And again, especially in those two attractions, that's why they kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, with Horizons especially. I mean, I even remember like the transitions between scenes where they would have these really basic hallways. And they would just light them in a certain way where you'd be like, wow, these hallways are amazing. And it was basically just like this thin hallway of nothing that they had to do to get you from one scene to the next. But the transitions were so good. And the way that the floor plan, I've seen like the blueprints, the way they wind you around that building because they had to cut size at one point near the end of the budget. And the fact that somehow you're able to go through and it all kind of fits together is amazing. It's such an oddly constructed but brilliant attraction the way it's put together.
You're absolutely right. It's incredible, and I love the way you go through the levels. You kind of some of the kind of the sea scenes, that you descend and you kind of start above in the kind of briefing rooms, and then you go down and you're under the water and you're looking back at people looking at you. It's this kind of constantly dynamic. You're never really in one place for too long. You're constantly moving. There's always something for your eye to see. And to me, it still remains one of the most unique dark rides. I mean, again, if we talk about something like Haunted Mansion, this is a very different experience. That's more kind of atmospheric. This was really telling, again, it was telling a story of this family. And again, it was the kind of evolution of the Carousel of Progress, I guess. But it was more than that. It was kind of a feeling. It was a mood that Horizons was doing, which was amazing. As you said, the way it kind of snakes around that building, it's fantastic, and it was a huge show building, and you just think, would anyone ever build a ride like that today? Probably not.
Well, it's one of those things too where they used a clever ride system, and then the way it was different than an Omnimover because it was facing out, but the way that they pack so much into that building, it's just one of those things where I think they could have done so much less and gotten away with it, but it's one of those where you look and you're like, how did they? And then you come to the middle and there's the giant Omnisphere. So it's like almost like a Soar and Flight of Passage type thing, but done to a much simpler form. And then you go back into, like you said, there's the Carousel of Progress connection. And I don't want to derail the conversation because I could.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, I could totally just be like, let's talk about Horizons for 2 hours.
How great was Horizons? Yeah.
Oh yeah, it was great. But I think it gets to a good point about what interested you about getting into themed entertainment in general. So I know you graduated from college with a theater design degree. And how did you go about then going from that to then? I know you worked in some roles before Disney, and how did you kind of transition from that into finding roles doing what you were looking to do with design for themed attractions?
As you say, I did my kind of degree in theatre design, and in the last year, the second and then the third, the last year of that, I was really kind of torturing my professors and my tutors to say, I have an idea of what I'd like to do my final project, and it's not a theatre piece. To which they were kind of shocked and gobsmacked, because this is a theatre design course, and you should be designing something like for Brecht or for, this play text. And I was saying, well, I'd really love to do something for my own project, because in the third year of this particular course, you could kind of have a project that you could kind of self-create almost. And I said, I have an idea. I'd like to do like a a theme park attraction. I'd like to, do something like that. And, my tutors were great, but they didn't really understand what I was asking of them. And they didn't really see the correlation between entertainment design and, how it exists within theatre, that kind of pure form of entertainment design and, artistically, and compared to what they would think of as like an amusement park, like almost, I guess their thought would be comparable in America to like a Six Flags or something. It was just all roller coasters. So, but I was really trying to push them and say, look, this is something I'd like to do when I leave. I'd love to go into this theme entertainment design. So they did let me do pieces of that and to kind of build up a portfolio. But luckily, I think it was a visiting tutor had a connection to Disneyland Paris, and she was a creative director, designer for Disneyland Paris's parades and floats. And she actually came over to the UK to do a talk. And of course, I was just, went over to her and tried to, and she kind of introduced me to some contacts in Imagineering, Disneyland Paris. And then that kind of was the start of about 8 years almost of kind of back and forth interviews, portfolio sharing, refinement of with Disney. But at the same time, I was kind of, building a portfolio and working for, UK companies over here that have theme parks, like Merlin Entertainments, etc. Just so that I could, have a background and actually get used to, because I'd been to theme parks and done that, but it was showing other people that I could do it. And, a large thing that, I still get people ask me today, what is the secret to being Imagineering? How do you become an Imagineer, etc. But back in the day when I was doing this, I was kind of really completely fudging my portfolio and just, creating things like, wow, I've just done a design for something that could be used in a, futuristic pavilion, and it's a food cart, or here's the exterior of a restaurant, or here's like a rough ground plan of a ride. I was kind of creating these things that would exist purely from a portfolio perspective, but that could show people like Disney or other designers that you get what theme park design is. And it's not just drawing the pretty pictures, it's making sure that you understand how how scale works, how guests flow through your attraction, how they see it artistically. And if for example you are doing a story, for example, let's say it's in the Wild West, what does that era look like? Are you using the appropriate tools and things like that? So I was really refining all the time to get better at what I wanted to do. So it was a completely self-directed process, I guess, really.
It's good that you bring up too the like restaurant fronts or shop fronts, because I feel like a lot of us who are not designers easily look at theme park design and say, I want to design a giant pavilion that could go anywhere that's this massive thing. But I suspect that a lot of the design that a lot of Imagineers are doing is some of that, but also storefronts and carts that sell food or whatever. So it sounds like you had a pretty good gauge, even just for mentioning that, on the various things you would do. And like you mentioned, the reality of it, which I know is something that a lot of us don't think about when we think about theme parks.
It really is. I think that the reality of that is the biggest thing that, as you say, people don't quite get when you're talking about the business. I mean, it is a business, and I don't just mean a business in terms of the economics of how it's run, but a business in terms of operationally, how you manage these things, how this thing you're designing is going to withstand, just withstand, how it's going to stand up, and how it's going to, withhold itself against the elements. And, for example, things like if you're having, the exterior of an attraction, where are your cast members going to stand? You're going to have a greeting booth. What's that greeting booth going to be? All these kind of things, you have to think about it kind of holistically. So, and there was a good friend of mine when I was at Imagineering, he's retired now, but Patrick Brennan, who was a vice president of Imagineering, when I first started, he came over to Hong Kong, and he said that a lot of Imagineers would always cut their teeth. He said never be too big to design a food cart, or do you know what I mean? He would always say that, and there were a lot of big Imagineers who would have to do that, because sometimes you could be working on a big project and you're waiting for it to go to like an approval, or maybe your funding gets cut and you're between projects, and someone will come and say to you, look, I need this food cart designed for Animal Kingdom, or for this thing for Hollywood Studios, can you do it? And I never think you can be too big to sort of say, wow, this is a food cart, this is nothing's everything. As an Imagineer, every single thing within that theme park, for me, is giving the same amount of credibility and thought process as the biggest attraction, the biggest thing that you'd kind of put money towards, the biggest capital investment. For me, again, there was one point when I first started, I did a concept for pool fences. I was between jobs. There was a big job that was kind of finishing, there was a big job that was about to start, and someone said, have you got time? And it was pool fences. And you'd think about that, and it's just, okay, you still have to do research, because it might be, if it's Coronado Springs, and it's, you have to kind of go into that kind of Mexican world, you still have to do research, you can't just phone anything in. So as you say, and food carts are an absolutely, it's where a lot of people start with that kind of thing. When you're doing the smaller, designs to prove yourself to do the bigger things, you still have to have that same system of values. Okay, if this is a food cart and it's existing in, for example, and again, in Animal Kingdom, if it's in Africa, for example, okay, well, Africa is very much there's a kind of a reality to Africa in Animal Kingdom that you have to kind of portray. So you don't also want to be culturally sensitive to that. And this isn't about saying this is a poor Africa, but you have to reflect that in the design you're doing. There has to be a reality to it. So again, it's about research. It's about, going into that. There's no kind of quick book like, oh, I'll just open up my book of cart designs, page 15. I'll do one of those. So for me, it's the whole theme park experience. Genuinely, as an Imagineer, you look at everything from the graphic on a trash can to how a huge building looks silhouetted against the sky of something. That those two things should have the same amount of time and energy given to them in a way.
Yeah, and I think the best parks, like the original Disneyland or Animal Kingdom or whatnot, have that, where essentially you don't get taken out of the environment. Like the worst thing could be if you are in this really themed environment and then there's a giant Coke bottle there and you're like,
exactly,
why is that there?
Exactly.
I'm not thinking of any particular example.
No.
It's more just, I'm not calling it. I just think that's just an example of something you've got to find a way to make it fit. But I'd love to talk to you about one of your early projects before Disney, which is I'm a big fan of Doctor Who, though I haven't caught up, unfortunately, with Jodie Whittaker with the latest version, but up through Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi and David Tennant and everything. So I know you worked on the Doctor Who experience in London, which I believe originally was with Matt Smith as the Doctor. This kind of walk through themed attraction with the Weeping Angels and the Daleks and everything. So I'd love to know how you got involved with that and how that came together.
Absolutely. Well, it's funny because I was a huge Doctor Who fan as a kid as well. I mean, obviously, I kind of grew up on it here, and it was on BBC, and it was kind of after 7:00, and it was kind of, I was just at that kind of cusping. You're kind of that just a little bit older than a child, but you can appreciate it. And it was, Doctor Who back in those days was kind of a little bit scary. I think for people of a certain age, you will remember it being, it's a little bit darker than it is now. The Doctor Who now is still good, but it's just not quite as dark. So I kind of grew up on that, and it just happened. I'd taken a job with another UK design firm, and this was before I moved to Hong Kong. Actually, I'd just done some interviews with Disney, but it was between, and I'd stayed there for about a year or so. And as I started, they kind of explained to me that they were going after this big, BBC contract. They couldn't explain to me what it was, blah blah blah. It was, and I'd been there for a couple of weeks, and they said, right, we've actually won this pitch to get this Doctor Who attraction. So I was like, oh my goodness, this, I love Doctor Who, and they asked me if I knew anything about it. I said, yeah, I actually, do. It's in my kind of wheelhouse of things that I could draw upon. So, and it was interesting because there had never been any Doctor Who attraction in the UK or globally at that point. This was the first, ever time that you'd actually been able to experience Doctor Who from a kind of a themed entertainment standpoint. So it was really exciting to me to be kind of one of the the lead designers on this and to create a world. And it was also extremely challenging because Doctor Who is obviously, it's an IP, but at the same time, it's different from a way for Disney because there's an expectation that people are going to bring, if they come to a Doctor Who experience, they're going to want to kind of tick those boxes. So, for example, as you mentioned, you're going to want to see the Weeping Angels. You're going to want to see, especially the Daleks. There's going to have to be a Dalek encounter. So that kind of starts to kind of craft the story you're going to tell because you kind of almost know you're going to have to kind of hit those story beats within it. So it was great fun, but it was actually really challenging as well to kind of craft a story that would allow you to kind of go on this time travel adventure. And at that time, Matt Smith had just begun as the Doctor. He was brand new, and we were being shown the episodes before they were released because it was a few months out from being released. So we were kind of working at the beginning. We were almost working in tandem with the production side of it. They were doing we were getting rushes from them, and they were on final VFX, things like that. And we were seeing it. We were trying to kind of craft this story about what there was going to be. And I remember at one point we weren't actually kind of privy to what the TARDIS was going to look like, the interior of the TARDIS. So we had to kind of really wait for that to become available to us, and we were kind of quite far into the design, and it was like, okay, here's what the TARDIS is going to look like, because they were so concerned about it being leaked. We finally got the image, and then we had to recreate that for the kind of show, and we actually ended up building. We wanted to build two of them. I think we ended up doing that. The fact you would start in the TARDIS, we needed you to come back to it to feel like you'd left the TARDIS but came back, so we had to build two identical sets. But the other thing that was, obviously, it was a space constraint, because as it was in London, as you can imagine, London is hugely expensive in terms of rent and what you can do. So having something like a moving, like an Omni-Mover ride was completely out of the question. And also it kind of lent itself to more of a walkthrough experience where you could kind of go and experience these things, again, walking through the graveyard of the Weeping Angels and having a kind of Dalek encounter on a ship. All of this stuff it lent itself to it. But it was, again, a once in a lifetime project for me. It was really exciting to be a part of that, really.
So was it a challenge, because you said you had space limitations, and obviously you have to set up the TARDIS where you're walking in and it has to go from very small to very big, like somehow with the room. Was that tricky? Or I mean, I can figure out how you could do it. You just have a room and then another room and make it kind of a doorway. But did you have challenges, especially with doing two of them, getting that to fit?
I can completely tell that you do like a themed entertainment design podcast, because you've actually hit upon the biggest challenge we had. The fact that, for anyone who doesn't know about Doctor Who, obviously that the Doctor has this thing, his and her, excuse me, she's it's the Doctor is kind of gender fluid. This TARDIS, which is actually an old fashioned kind of 1930s 40s, I guess, kind of police call box. It's like a blue police box with a light on the top, and again, it's like a telephone box, so that's very small. In reality, you could probably fit one person in there comfortably. Two completely, fine, would be too much, and then three would be out of the question. So, and then when you do step inside of it, and the whole thing about Doctor Who is you step inside, and then it's much, much bigger on the inside. It's a huge space. So, for us, from a logistical kind of standpoint of doing this as a themed attraction, you can have hundreds, you can have tens of guests kind of going into this space. So we had to cheat the scale of the TARDIS. We had to make the TARDIS a little bit bigger. I think we kind of put that into the story a little bit and kind of cheated that a bit. So, and then the door, both doors open, double doors, which were kind of code compliant doors that we had to have. And then you'd enter into we built a smaller kind of there was a small room that kind of was a corridor that we worked with the TARDIS design, with the TARDIS designer for the show. He kind of gave his blessing to that. You kind of walked in, and then the TARDIS, the interior was about the scale it was on the show, actually a little bit bigger, because the set again for the show only needs to fit the Doctor and a kind of camera crew in it. It's a little bit smaller in real life, whereas our one needed to be much bigger. So we kind of, again, cheated the scale, increased the set a little bit. So as you say, that's kind of one of the realities when you do themed entertainment design, that people kind of want to see something that's on the screen, or they've seen it at the movie theater and everything, and they want to experience that. But it's our job to kind of realize that from a three-dimensional standpoint, that you're going to look around it, you're going to touch things, you're going to what does it smell like in there, and again, it also comes back to code compliant things. Like we want to make sure that every single guest, the shortest guest, the tallest guests who are in wheelchairs, need to be able to access this completely. So that in itself is probably one of the biggest challenges of our job, that it just kind of, it's with you all the time when you're a designer. You're going to have that in the back of your mind when you're designing something.
Right. It's a case where, again, kind of getting back to the way you would draw a concept is, you can make the coolest, most amazing TARDIS that's, as good or better than anything on the show. And then it's like, well, how are people going to walk through that? And you're like, I don't know.
Exactly. And that's kind of one of the things I try and pride myself in my career, is the fact that I've tried to have this balance of being really kind of lofty and blue sky. You push for the stars. You kind of, what's the best experience we can do? However, I try and ground a reality in there that makes it, you're not just drawing these things where, I remember there's a really funny Joe Roddy painting for Expedition Everest, where, the Yeti's holding a giant Yeti's holding this ride car, and these guests are running out of it. And it's funny because it's just a mood. He's just basically trying to elaborate the fact that this is going to be, the Yeti's going to destroy the track kind of thing. But, when that gets boiled down to the reality of this concept, okay, how are we really going to do this? Everyone's going to be in a roller coaster car, and or etc. And like you said with the TARDIS, it's about bringing the reality to a great concept. So it's having those two things, work in tandem, and still doing, delivering a really great experience.
Definitely. Well, let's get to Imagineering. So I know you started there in 2011 full time. How did you go about, interviewing and actually getting hired to work at Walt Disney Imagineering?
Well, so basically, as I said, it was around 8 years or so of interviews and, back and forths and portfolio submissions and, refinements, things like that. And I'd actually done some freelance by that point for Disneyland Paris. And there was a lady there who's still at Disneyland Paris called Kathleen Nunes, and she's such a wonderful dear friend of mine. And from what I've heard from people in Imagineering, the one thing that has kind of been constant is you kind of have a champion, someone who is, looking out for you and just becomes that kind of mentor. And I've been really lucky to have probably a couple. I mean, I would say Kathleen was great, and also Don Carson, who's obviously a former Imagineer. But again, every one of your kind of podcast, audience probably would have heard of Don, his amazing work. So they were both, people I knew of, and that I could kind of check in with them in terms of my work and how it was going. And as I said, Kathleen had kind of put me in touch with people at Disneyland Paris. Had done some kind of freelance for them. I was refining my style and everything. And then she just said, if you want to have a job, we might be having something coming up soon in Paris. Would you do that? And I said, yeah, probably would move to Paris. I'd love to be an Imagineer. And then again, that comes into the realities of if you want to be an Imagineer, you've got to really move around the world. And then she called me actually one day, and that was when I was kind of I'd finished the Doctor Who thing. It was kind of towards the end of that part of my job in London, and she called me out of the blue and she said, are you sitting down? And I thought, okay, no, I'm not. I'm stood outside, but everything okay? And she said, well, there is a job in Imagineering that you're going to interview for. And I said, that's great. Okay. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm going to move into Paris. And she said, it's actually a role in Hong Kong. And so I kind of had forgotten that Disney had a park in Hong Kong, and it was relatively new. I think it had only been open a few years. It probably been open about 4 or 5 years, I think, at the time. It was relatively new. So I'd completely forgotten. I was like, oh, wow. And then I had 2 phone interviews with, the Imagineers in Hong Kong, and I just seemed to be the right fit for them. And I was literally, I think it was about 6 or 8 weeks later, I was packing up my life in the UK and then on a plane and landing in a very, very hot and humid Hong Kong, thinking, oh my goodness, what have I done?
Yeah, so I know Hong Kong is the one that, I hate to say it, but that sometimes people forget about, especially at that time before Mystic Manor and everything else being Grizzly Gulch and everything being added to it. How challenging was that? One thing, you're starting in Imagineering, something you wanted to do for years, and then 2, you're going to work on somewhere that maybe you hadn't considered that you would end up working there. Was that a challenge to then move to an entirely new culture and start at this big role?
It really was for me, because for me, I'd always imagined that I would probably start at Paris. Definitely going to Florida or California would have been the dream, but I knew that was going to be harder in terms of working visas or all of that kind of thing. But for me, I always thought it was going to be Paris first. So I wasn't prepared for it to be Hong Kong. And as I said, this was a kind of a new park as well. But very quickly, once I'd moved to Hong Kong, it was a very, very small Imagineering team. And it was good for my career in that sense, because it was such a small team. Going in as the lead kind of concept designer for the base park, coming in for the permanent team there, I had an influence on everything. I was doing hotel room designs. I was doing, attraction facades, restaurants, carts and wagons and things. It was everything. So it was kind of a baptism of fire, really. So not only were you kind of having to navigate this culture, and again, Hong Kong, for anyone who's been there, it's an amazing city. And again, it was a really fantastic 4 years of my life, in Hong Kong, with my wife, and our son was born there. So it was fantastic. But you have to kind of live in parallel with this city that's, amazing and dynamic and quite intense and all of that. And then you also kind of having to, I felt like when I was at Hong Kong, we were really kind of trying to bring the park up to its full potential. Now they're investing a lot more in it. When I look at what's happening with Hong Kong now, it's so funny, because obviously when we were there, we were constantly pitching new attractions and new rides, and we were pushing all the time, and it just needed that big investment that it got. Now that it has, with the new Frozen Land that's coming, and obviously when I was there, it had been greenlit for the Mystic Manor, and Grizzly Gulch and Toy Story Land had been greenlit, but Toy Story Land was the last piece of the puzzle, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners would know, but I don't know if you do, but basically there was supposed to be a land there called Glacier Bay, I think it was called, which was more of this kind of snowy environment. And I think, I'm not quite sure of the history of this, but I think it was similar to a project that was being planned for Ocean Park, which is kind of a competitor, I think. So that was one of the things that kind of forced it to its evolution to kind of stop. And then another thing, I think that there were management at the time, or there were people who felt like it needed an existing IP, the story that people, I think there was a kind of almost stepping back, having Grizzly Gulch, which was a new kind of land and a new experience, and then Mystic Point, which was a new experience, having something that would kind of ground it. So Toy Story seemed like a kind of I don't want to say a safe bet, that's the wrong thing, but it would kind of seem like a good starting point between those 3 lands. So I came in at Toy Story Land and was right at that development of that. And obviously it didn't have a retail space, so I kind of was really heavily involved in Andy's Toy Box, which was hilarious because I was Andy and everyone on the project team thought it was named after me. It was like, no, it's Andy from the films. So it was a really fun and challenging time to be at Hong Kong, because as I said, we were trying to push the park to be, to live up to its potential. And I never thought they'd actually rebuild the castle. It was something that was being talked about, like, should we kind of add to the castle? Should we change change it. And it's fantastic to see now that there's a brand new castle, a much taller castle being built on top of the existing castle.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the evolution of that park, because like you mentioned with Frozen, then they're doing the Stark Expo that they're putting in there. And then the castle, which to me, yeah, is really unprecedented. I mean, we've seen things like in Disneyland where they add little colors or they changed a bit to it, but nothing on this scale. I mean, this is astounding to me. But and I mean, coming from the States, we look at things though in Hong Kong and we see that they had two, like you said, two lands with Mystic Point and Grizzly Gulch without connections directly to a movie, and we're like, oh my gosh, we're so jealous. That's amazing. But,
exactly.
Yeah, it's like, wow, that's great. But I wanted to ask you though about doing even Andy's Toy Box, because it doesn't surprise me that they wanted to have Toy Story in there, and I'm not making it nefarious, just that makes sense, especially given the Toy Story lands there's one in Paris, there's now one in Hollywood Studios. I mean, they're very common in a lot of different parks. But when you're trying to, like with that Andy's Toy Box or with something like that, as a designer, like you're using existing characters, you're trying to create something that's unique but still connects to the source material. How challenging is that, or what's kind of the trick that you've learned about being able to do that even in a space just like a retail space?
Yeah, Andy's Toy Box was an interesting project because, as I said, it came really late into the design of Toy Story Land. So essentially, as you said, they'd picked the attractions they wanted to have, the Green Army Men parachute drop, and Slinky Dog was going to be there. But they kind of had sort of I'm trying to be careful with how I say this, but they kind of slightly micromanaged that and hadn't thought big enough for that land. I think there was originally supposed to be a retail space there, but it was kind of, when I was there, it was kind of decided that it needed that kind of extra footfall and knowing the popularity of these Toy Story characters. And to your point as well, it was a good idea to put Toy Story in because, the Toy Story characters, Buzz and Woody, are hugely popular in Asia and in Hong Kong. So when I came into that, this toy box needed to really kind of speak a language that would be apparent because, this is probably a separate conversation, but designing for guests in Asia compared to designing when I was designing in America and in Florida, they're completely different. I mean, to say, it's a different audience is, it's an understatement. And again, and people like, Tom Morris and other people will know about this, the fact that what someone will actually visually understand and have a, emotional connection with in the States compared to Paris and Hong Kong is completely different. And I think this was kind of coming right. Hong Kong, once Hong Kong had opened, it was just that start of that learning curve for Disney pre-Shanghai of learning, oh my goodness, Disney exists here in this parts of the world, but it's not what we think it is, or guests identify with things differently. So, for example, one of the biggest challenges we had there, and I'm segueing from the toy box, I'll come back to it, but it was Space Mountain. One of the things we would always have was that guests would complain at Hong Kong Disneyland because they didn't understand what Space Mountain was. Some people thought it was a convention space, that this was this huge void, like what's in here? And that design thinking led to some of the rides and attractions for Grizzly Gulch, for example, that became a terrain coaster. It was because we kind of wanted guests to see what these attractions were. They had more of a sense of what they were because historically a lot of Imagineering is done within a box because you can control the light level and the sound and the music, etc. So that was a learning curve. And, again, going back to Andy's Toy Box, to your question was, this had to work iconically for people to understand what it was. So we kind of did this again with Toy Story World. You've kind of got this bucket of parts you can use, really. So the kind of the cardboard box, and Andy's done these kind of drawings on the side. So it was my job to kind of be Andy for that. And I kind of had almost a blank sheet of paper, really, to kind of create these drawings and how Andy would assess that and how he'd make the cardboard and do all of that. And then the good part of that was I got to work really close with everyone at Pixar because obviously they, Pixar care very, very deeply about their characters, and even though it's Disney, Pixar exists in its own right, and you still have to kind of, do due diligence with them to say, yeah, hey, we're going to have Woody's face here. Woody's going to be doing this. You have people at Pixar, Roger Gould, people like that, who are actually going to oversee that from an artistic direction perspective. So, and things, I remember one of the challenges we had was that we had these inside the space with these gondolas, these kind of like merchandise gondolas and things. And again, going back to what we started talking about, is that everything has a story. Everything has, and I know people say this about Imagineering all the time, but it is true that once you're inside this cardboard box, you have to think, well, Andy wouldn't just build necessarily merchandising stands. How would he create these things? And we kind of figured a way to have like domino pieces and, jumping jacks and things doing that. And I kind of really pushed to have some kind of toy money in there, because it just was a kind of nice change of pace to have something kind of graphically represented. So the fun thing about that was that I got to kind of create this kind of Toy Story money. And then by doing that, it kind of started a larger discussion about, okay, well, this money must have come from a game, and it was Woody's game. And I kind of came up with this backstory. It was literally just for me to do it and for kind of Pixar to kind of be involved with how it kind of begun. And no one in the store is ever going to look at that and think about that. But that's the kind of level of detail that I went to within that design, and getting the train tracks right, the paint level on that and everything. It is a lot that went into that, that store, even though it doesn't probably look like it to the average guest. It is a challenge in that regard to kind of fit all of that design into that small space, really.
Yeah, well, it reminds me again, too, of things that, so much going into every element of the parks, which even if we don't go in and think about exactly what went into it, you kind of can sense when something is done really well. And also, too, like you brought up, and I've heard this in terms of Main Street and other areas when you're in the parks in Asia, where you have to adjust, or they've even said we can't do Twilight Zone Tower of Terror in Japan because no one will know what that means, or, different adjustments you have to make, which are easy to forget here, where also too, the parks with Disneyland being, 64 years old and Disney World being there so long, it's to fans is a little just we're used to it. So I'm sure that just adds extra layers. And that brings me to what I find to be such a fascinating thing you worked on, which is this Halloween version of the Jungle Cruise.
Yeah.
I watched the video, and it wasn't the best video, but it gave kind of a good gauge of it. I just love the idea because, again, I think I heard you talk about this on another podcast, where you have to consider how people in Hong Kong even look at Halloween and everything. So how did that design come together, and especially considering some of those challenges you might have?
Yeah, you bring up a really fun project. That was probably one of the most fun projects I've ever worked on in Imagineering, that Jungle River Cruise, because the project came about because Hong Kong Disney was actually I believe was the first park to have the Ghost Galaxy overlay for Space Mountain, which then kind of transitioned to Disneyland, came a few years later. But essentially that kind of started at Hong Kong, and we'd had a lot of success with kind of having these attraction overlays, especially for Halloween. I mean, Halloween in Hong Kong is extremely popular. It's become a really kind of American adopted holiday over there in Hong Kong and Asia. But they, and I hate to sound like I'm really kind of generalizing the entire Asian population here, but at the time, and there is a certain population in Hong Kong who really enjoy the kind of more scary aspects of Halloween. They really, to them, it's a little bit more kind of thrilling, a little bit more gory, is a little bit kind of pushed right to the edge of that kind of horror. Because I think when Hong Kong Disneyland originally opened, some of the Halloween product was kind of more typical to, a castle park, and then, through guest feedback and everything. And then obviously from Ocean Park, which is a kind of another theme park in Hong Kong, they were doing a lot more thrilling, and they were kind of getting that kind of guest mix a little bit more than Hong Kong was. So then we kind of rethought the product, and it became a bit more thrilling. And there was a time where it was at Tomorrowland, and it was kind of really kind of alien and really kind of pushing the envelope of what Disney could do for Halloween. I mean, just from an Imagineering perspective, I kind of remember thinking, this is something we would never do in Florida or California. It just wouldn't fly. You just kind of know it in your bones. So this is where, for me, it was interesting being, a British-based designer, or like having coming from a British perspective, because I was at that kind of unique crossroads to be, learning about the Asian culture and what that audience liked, and really immersing myself in, but also knowing about the, completely immersed in Disney and the history of Disney, and knowing about what those parks made up, and then bringing those together. And so after the success of Ghost Galaxy, we had another kind of blue sky session, and we were really challenged to say, look, we would love to do another an overlay of a land or an attraction for Halloween coming up. We just kind of kicked around ideas, and I don't think it was me that said Jungle River Cruise. I think someone else did, and there was a few other attractions kind of going around again, and for me that just sounded like such an amazing proposition to be able to take that. It's a very long ride, it's kind of iconic, and it's out in the open. I thought, okay. And And I think it's on my website, but I was sat there and we were having this blue sky session, and we were obviously, because it's a blue sky session, everyone's got kind of like postcard sizes, and we're sketching, we're talking. It's fantastic, to be involved in an Imagineering blue sky. Even when you're there, you still have to kind of pinch yourself. It's such a wonderful thing. And I did this really quick sketch of a Jungle Cruise boat, and there's a skipper holding a flashlight down, and the lights just cutting through the dark and illuminating this hand coming out of the water. And I just kind of drew it really quickly. And I kind of didn't know what I was doing. It was almost a bit like, okay, we know it's going to be nighttime, and how would that look? And the management really kind of jumped on that and was like, wow, okay, it's kind of evocative, and let's just push it. So I was kind of put in charge of developing that attraction with entertainment. And so it was great because I was given completely kind of carte blanche, just blank canvas to say, okay, let's do an attraction, Halloween attraction overlay for Jungle River Cruise. And then it became really daunting to me because you have an existing attraction that's been there from park opening, and again, it's based in water, and you have a ride vehicle that's existing, you have these existing show scenes, and we were somewhat limited to what we could and couldn't do. For example, we can't remove some of the big show sets, but we had to dress them in a way, and again, that really informed, kind of similar to Doctor Who, I suppose. The story had to be crafted around these iconic elements of going through the safari, the Serengeti and the elephant pools and things. We knew we were going to kind of darken some of the show lighting to not have them, but then we needed to add a new story in, and so the story became about this kind of very nefarious explorer, the kind of almost like the dark side of Indiana Jones, the kind of the shadowy side of him. And he was this kind of explorer out to collect these three kind of stones, the Emerald Trinity as it became. And he was kind of out to take them from they existed in the jungle. He's out to take them, and they provide immortality, and then the jungle kind of almost fights back. And one thing that I really pushed for was we ended up removing the hippos from the hippo scene, the attack scene, and we had these kind of what I called almost like vine creatures, and it kind of got my concept back in there, that they were literally lurched out of the water. So we took the hippo shells, kept the mechanism of them lurching out of the water with these hands and these vine creatures coming out, and we kind of had this low-lying fog on there, and it was lit by it, and it was really kind of thrilling. And to do it in tests and adjustment phase, it was fantastic. And I remember thinking, oh my good, but then there was part of me that's thinking, what have I done to Walt Disney Jungle River Cruise? Is anyone going to forgive me for doing this?
Well, it's funny. Somehow it had mostly escaped my notice until pretty recently. But I think about, we went on the Jungle Cruise in Florida at night a few years ago, and this was the normal Jungle Cruise. And I was like, this is a little freaky. Just going there at night already, because it's not really lit up, and you're going through some of those narrow waterways. And then I watched the video, and there's like this whole thing where you have you're seeing it in shadow, but the vines come up and grab this guy, and it's like, oh my gosh.
That's right. It was amazing. We ended up for that scene, as you say, for the gorilla camp scene, we closed the scene down. We couldn't actually move the animatronics down. That was one of the things that, again, cost and time and everything. We couldn't remove the gorilla animatronics, so we kind of sealed the show set down and used projection mapping on the front of that, but then created part of the story that, again, the jungle was actually reclaiming the stones, and himself. He was kind of sucked down into the earth. So again, this was me getting to do kind of the show writing thing, but it was, as you say, completely. We ended up walking when we first started the development of the attraction, the Halloween overlay. We ended up walking the space, so we would walk the backside of the attraction, because this was about 11 o'clock at night. All the guests have gone. It's pitch black. We had torches, and we were walking the kind of land side of the Jungle Cruise, and it was really eerie. It already had that sense of being mysterious and dark, and you didn't know what was through the shadows and everything. And again, just the reality of this, that in Hong Kong you have spiders and mosquitoes, and there was an actual real reality of the terrifying side of it. And then what we did, we then boarded the boat, and we kind of circled around the attraction a few times in the dark. And I just said to everyone, can we just turn all the show lights off? Let's just, we brought these big torches, these really powerful torches we could find. We were just testing out how evocative it was, and completely, as you say, I said to we had a Jungle Cruise driver, and I said, can you just stop the boat here? And the boat engine would die, and it'd be silent, and we'd be cutting through the night with this torch. And it was, as you say, I thought, well, some of the work is already done here, because it's so eerie and evocative. And as soon as you kind of looking at him, the torch would kind of capture these animals, and you couldn't quite tell what was in the shadows. And it was amazing. And it's a shame, as you say, you're seeing it on YouTube, because no one ever really got a good enough video of that. And it was to say the video doesn't do it justice is an understatement. It was such an evocative ride to do on the boat and be scared and not knowing what was coming up. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's one of those things where even 4 years later from 2015, the videos would be so much better because I think about it, the video I saw, I was like in the back of the boat and I'm like, there's cool stuff happening that I can't really see.
Yeah, and no one ever captures what's going on because the cameras never pan down to the particular show scenes that happen. So you can never quite, excuse me, you can never quite get a good enough view of the attraction on those videos.
Well, it's really cool. And there's one other attraction I wanted to ask you about in Hong Kong, the Fairy Tale Forest, which to me seems almost like it's like a walkthrough and it's interactive, but it reminds me a little bit of like if you walk through the Storybook Land at Disneyland or in Paris and kind of did it as a different way. And I know it only opened in 2015, I believe, but I'm curious what it was like to put that together.
Also, basically, again, this is coming back to Hong Kong Disneyland, where there was a real economic kind of force at work there, and we were really looking to put some new product into the park. We really wanted to put something back in, and honestly, there was some kind of financial restrictions with that. So we wanted to kind of fill out the little parcel of kind of Fantasyland there, and it's right against the train tracks of the Fantasyland train station there, and we also kind of wanted to make it more of an old-fashioned, as completely as you said, we were talking about what would happen if you kind of took the Casey Junior Railroad or the riverboats and took the Storybook Canal boats, if you took the water out and made this a walking tour. And we specifically wanted it to be about the horticulture and, these little kind of dioramas. It was very much like, you could see them from the boat or, from the Storybook Canal boat, you can see these dioramas. But what if you could kind of get closer to them and see them and, the craftsmanship of those things. So that was the task we were given, and as I said, we were working with financial constraints as well with that, but I do think it ended up being a really nice kind of sweet project, and it was intended to be that kind of sweet, gentle walking tour because, again, I think Hong Kong needed that kind of, it was, almost going back to the ticket books, you have your, e-ticket. It was kind of that kind of B or C ticket, and it's not to detract from that at all, but it's just to kind of, as Tony Baxter, I think as Tom Morris say, to kind of, level the expectations for guests of what they're going to be seeing. Oh, this is like a really quaint walking attraction, and again, it's showing guests, it's out in the open, guests can see it, and from a topiary perspective in Hong Kong, they're fantastic at growing things, and because of the climate, you can really get some amazing topiaries. They have some really, fantastic artisans over there who are on a par with the artists in kind of Florida who create the topiary. So we knew from that point the actual forest would grow up really, really quickly, and it's really fun. You can kind of crank handles and things happen. Kids, younger guests really enjoy it, and again, I think that was important for us as well to kind of have something that younger guests would enjoy as well. And I really enjoyed doing the marquee as you enter the Fairy Tale Forest has, touches of kind of hand-carved characters, and then it was really quaint and charming, and I was really trying to kind of channel that original Disneyland, aspect to that rather than, it was kind of going back to more of an old school kind of Imagineering, I guess, kind of the old school style of Disneyland, Fantasyland, essentially, really.
Yeah, I think it does a nice job of, and I haven't been there, but unlike for the Jungle Cruise, it's very easy to find really good videos where people walk through and they crank everything and you can kind of see what happens. But it has that, I wouldn't even say quaint, but it has that kind of pleasant or relaxing vibe to it, which I think you really need in a theme park, because while roller coasters are amazing and while thrill rides are amazing and even grand dark rides, sometimes you just need to kind of mosey around a bit and just enjoy kind of little things. And I think it's very pleasant even watching a video, and I suspect even one person, very attractive area. And like you said, I think by now, because I probably was watching a video for more recent, as the kind of foliage grows, it just looks more impressive.
It does, and you're completely right. I think it's kind of forgotten in, theme park master planning sometimes that everyone's always pushing for this big e-ticket attraction and what's the big thing, what's the big draw. But I completely agree with you. The fact that you have to have a menu of things. For example, you don't just go to a restaurant and have steak, all the time. You need a starter, you need a side dish. The more, diverse the palette is, the more enjoyable for guests, and you can't put a high enough price on things that are just a walking tour and things that are, as you said, pleasant and just enjoyable and a diversion, and they allow you to kind of reset your senses before you necessarily go onto another, dynamic blast into the galaxy with Tony Stark or etc. It's you need to kind of have that breadth and that change, and that it's I guess it's comparable to kind of a sorbet. You just have that between meals, is that kind of, this is really charming, I think that's the word I'm trying to say, charming. The Fairy Tale Forest, we were just literally going for a charming quality that would really sit within Fantasyland Fantasyland, and again, allow for younger guests to enjoy something, because kids really enjoy this kind of cause and effect type of attractions that sometimes they don't get to experience. Everyone's kind of clamoring for the Space Mountains and things like that, and we really wanted to have that be something that kind of younger guests could experience and enjoy.
Yeah, for sure. Because we have a local like Six Flags amusement park here where I live, and every ride I feel like I'm just getting pummeled, and that's fun. That's fun for a few hours.
Yeah,
but once you're done with a few hours, you're like, okay, I'm going home. That's it.
Yeah,
can't do
absolutely.
Can't get pummeled by every ride, no matter what.
Yeah, too much steak. Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Totally. All right. Well, I know after Hong Kong, you spent a little bit of time working in Florida after that. I'm curious kind of how that transition went and kind of what you were doing there.
Yeah, so basically, whilst in Hong Kong, I had friends in Florida and I'd kept in touch with them. And a couple of things happened that were interesting. That there's a program within Imagineering where it allows you to kind of transition to different sites and kind of explore that other kind of site that you might not have done. So, for example, we would have people from Paris come over to Hong Kong, Florida come over to Japan, etc. Kind of move around the sites. And so a friend came over to Hong Kong, a lady called Beth. She came over to Hong Kong and she spent 2 months with us, and we just became firm friends. And obviously, she was really daunted coming to Hong Kong. It was a huge kind of challenge, but she'd come from Florida, and my wife and I kind of took her under our wing, and we became really great friends. And then the opportunity came for me to kind of pick a site. My leaders kind of said, "Would you like to kind of go somewhere?" And I was like, "Well, I would love to kind of spend my 2-3 months in Florida." So I did. I ended up to go there, and I spent time with them, got to meet all of the amazing people in Florida, and made lifelong friends there. And I was really passionate about going there. To be honest with you, they were really passionate about getting me over there, and it was probably nearly 2 years of work to kind of get me to move over to Florida from one way or another, and to kind of finish my work in Hong Kong. And I was transitioning at the time, so I was having to finish projects in Hong Kong and then begin projects in Florida, etc. And so, I ended up moving to Florida, and I was there for about a year and a half or something like that, I think. And I kind of got to a point where I wanted to move back to the UK. I didn't actually, it was my choice to leave Disney. There was a lot of things kind of happening back in the UK that I wanted to be a part of. So I was absolutely devastated to leave Imagineering and especially the Florida team, which was great. So, but in that year, it was a fantastic year for me because I got to work on such a diverse range of projects, and most of them were really conceptual. I was having a conversation with somebody the other day saying that, it is the curse and the blessing of a concept designer, which is kind of what I am. I'm more of the first initial kind of blue sky of projects, because the work you get to do is fantastic because it's challenging and you get to literally have that blank piece of paper and create something. But at the same time, there is a reality of those things that, sometimes a good portion of those projects don't actually ever see the light of day. I mean, I worked on, for example, a redo of Rock and Roller Coaster for a long time that was going to change that attraction to something else, and that didn't happen. And so you spend, and again, it's the reality of the industry. You spend months of your life, pouring your heart and your soul and things into these things, and then a presentation will happen or a meeting will happen, and then you finish on Friday, and then there's a meeting on a Monday, and then you get a phone call on Tuesday and say, that's no longer happening. We've got something else for you to work on. So, it's a pool fence, something like that. So as I say, it was a really great time in Florida. And like I said, I would love to be able to share with some of the things I did, but I probably still can't talk about some of the things in case they happen or whatever. But, conceptually that's one of the fun things that you get to do so many concepts. I mean, I worked on the initial versions of the Disney Cruise Line island. That's going to be, it was actually a different island, than the one that's going to be. I was working on that and some of the attractions and the water features that were going to go there. So I got to work on that, which was cool and again conceptual. So, and I think that's going to be it's going to be a different project. I think now that Joe Rohde's involved in that new island, it's going to be a completely different project than the one I was working on. So it's one of the the joys of Imagineering that you have these. And it's as fun to sometimes work on the things that don't see the light of day because of the people you got to work with and the work you got to do. Sometimes it's heartbreaking that it doesn't actually happen, but at the same time, the work is the reward, and you enjoy doing it really.
Having been to Alani that Joe Rohde worked on designing, the fact that he's working on that island, I mean, who knows what he's going to do? It's going to be something, I'm sure.
It's going to be amazing because I mean, the version that I was working was more kind of. There's definitely a story there, and there was more an architectural story. But I think that Joe is going to bring more of there's more of a human story to it, if I can say that. I think there's more of a an adventurous human side of it, and it's more rooted in kind of a culture. Whereas I think the version that we were working on was again, it's just a different. I don't think it was more positive or negative in that sense. It was just a different story. It was more rooted in kind of stories and architecture in that sense. And so again, really excited to see what he's going to do there.
Great. Well, I'm starting to wind down, but if you have time, I just have a few more questions for you, if that works out. I'd love to hear a bit more about Imagineering and if there were certain Imagineers you work with that really had a strong impact on you in Hong Kong or in Florida, or even just in general, just kind of what it was like to be there and how that kind of impacted you and what you're doing now.
Well, again, when you want to be an Imagineer and the actual, the state you're in when you want to be an Imagineer compared to when you have been an Imagineer and you're actually doing it, it's kind of breathtaking and amazing. I mean, I shall never forget when I'd officially moved to Florida and going into one of the Imagineering brainstorming sessions in Florida in the EPCOT building. And I mean, for me, it was literally a dream come true because it was the realization of, EPCOT was the first ever Disney, entertainment project I ever saw and experienced. And it, as we've talked about, it had such an indelible, print on my life. So going to the Imagineering office in EPCOT and actually walking through those gates, with a blue card, it's incredible. It literally is the realization of a dream. And then sitting in a room with these people who are these Imagineers, these incredible men and women, it's really daunting. And I remember talking to a friend of mine in Imagineering and saying, this first couple of weeks I was really nervous. And then someone said, look, if you're in the room, someone has seen something about you that feels like you can be in the room. And that was both reassuring and incredibly daunting as well, because you feel like, okay, I have a right to be here, but then also bring your A game all the time. But specifically with people, again, it's a really fantastic environment because everyone is so creative about everything. Everyone is so passionate about what they're doing. I really don't have any kind of horror stories about Imagineering. I mean, because it was such a wonderful time of my life to work there. And specifically people who I've worked with, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, Don Carson, who's kind of a really dear friend and mentor of mine. People can kind of look up his work on his website and actually, and again, I'm sure people will know about him anyway, but he is a fantastic Imagineer and a storyteller. And for me is almost a kind of a second generation of a Mark Davis. He has that incredible kind of, quick penmanship and can sum up a character and a pose and a story. And so he was someone who I know today and talk with and still is inspiring to me. And Jason Grant, especially at Imagineering in Florida, he's creative director now, but he's just an amazing person and an amazing personality. Really, he's so much fun and really kind of someone you can gain lots of experience and energy from. He's kind of, he's kind of fun to be around and really fun to work with. So any project that Jason was involved with, I was really kind of keen to be working with him on that.
Well, excellent. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you could go on for a while. Those are great examples of people that you work with. And I know now you're still doing some consulting, but you're also working at RMA themed attractions. And I'm curious, I don't know how much detail you can go to, but what type of work you're currently doing in your role now?
Well, yeah, I mean, the nice thing is I still get to work as a consultant with Disney, which is great. So when I left Florida, the team out there were really keen to kind of stay in touch with me, and I keep in touch with them and work with them. As I say, I get to do, elements of concepts of things, and I also still keep in touch with the team in Hong Kong. So I've just finished a package for, like a concept design package or something, which I probably can't talk about, but for Hong Kong, and like a mid-range kind of thing, nothing huge, I'm afraid. But, that's really great for me that I still kind of feel like I'm an Imagineer and get to kind of keep in touch with that. So, but in terms of working at RMA here in England, they're a great company because, they get to do things that aren't just, theme parks. We're currently working on something that's, more of a, almost like a museum visitor attraction, like the next generation of kind of what a museum is. And that's been really fantastic to me to kind of segue to something that's more real world. We're designing, at the moment, we're kind of consulting on a large kind of Roman, visitor attraction museum. And that's been, a challenge for me because obviously it's dealing with more of the real world, kind of bringing a lot more of that kind of edutainment into there as well, but still kind of trying to bring, specifically my Imagineering kind of side of things of, again, what is the kind of next generation? Because it feels like kind of museums and things like that are going through this evolution of not just being graphic panels on a wall. Visitors are looking for something different. So it's been really fun for me to kind of, I've specifically been brought in because of my theme park experience to kind of create something that's different and that's unique. I've literally, the people who have asked me to work in it have said, we're looking for a world-class visitor attraction. And that's been really exciting. So something different for me outside of Disney's been really fun as well.
Well, yeah, I've noticed it even just here in other cities I've been to that museums, aquariums, zoos, they're all they're all taking elements from theme design and doing a lot more than just what you would have expected 10 or 15 years ago. So I'm sure there's plenty of work like that to do, which is really cool to see.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, they ask us and say, I mean, I've been in meetings with people, when we've consulted for things about museums and these other attractions, and they'll say something like a Disney, or they'll use that phrase because of my, my unique placement, the fact I've worked with Disney, and I can say to them, like, when you kind of bring the name Disney up, what I'm saying to them is the fact that you're bringing up a thought process. You're bringing up, it's not about a huge investment, obviously, it's about a thought process of using a story, of staying true to that story and embodying that in the best way that you can, and making that really, again, this word gets overused, but immersive and true to the story that you're trying to tell. So it's kind of, showing them that the principles of Disney are just generally really good storytelling principles generally, that Disney used them so well that it's something that can, as you say, be brought into zoos and aquariums and museums, because it's the same standards that we've been using. It's a storytelling process, essentially.
Definitely. Well, Andy, this has been great to talk with you and learn more about your background. So if someone wants to connect with you either on social media, I know you're on Twitter and everywhere, where's a good place to go to learn more about your work or just what you're doing?
Well, like as you say, I'm kind of on Twitter. I've kind of come off of it a bit more recently, but I do kind of still check. So it's I think it's 185 per acre is my handle. I'm sure I haven't looked for a while, but again, if you want to reach out to me on Twitter, that'd be great. I always love kind of connecting with people. I do have a website, which again I haven't updated for some time, but andysinclairharris.com. You can check out some of the work that I've done that we've talked about. You can see some things, but and again, if anyone wants to reach out and talk to me, I'm always happy to kind of talk about the work I've done.
Excellent. Well, Andy, thanks so much for doing it. It was a blast to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. This has been really fun. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this show, I would suggest you check out episode 75 with Joe Lancicero, where he talks about what it was like to lead the Mystic Manor project at Hong Kong Disneyland. Joe also showed up in a recent episode of the Imagineering story. I've been doing recaps of every episode of that amazing show over on my website, tomorrowsociety.com. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can always email me. I love getting messages to dan@tomorrowsociety.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. If you would like to support the show, a great way to do so is through Patreon. You can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society and receive some really cool perks for a very small monthly contribution. My latest patron is Peter Shannon. Thanks so much to Peter and all of the other members who are helping to keep this listener-supported podcast rolling. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey, performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with author Dustin Engels about his book Around the World in 80 Days, One Fan's Journey to Conquer Disney's Magic Kingdoms. He went all around the world, saw every Disney park, and it's a really fun conversation that I think you will enjoy. Thank you so much for all the support and for listening to this episode. I'll talk to you again next week. Next week.